I'm Scott Segrist again, and now we're going to do our lesson on John Locke. Starting with Locke's philosophical and political significance. Locke was one of the most important forerunners or initiators of the Enlightenment. Um, he's writing in the late 1600s, and he begins to have a big impact in the 18th century. But as I mentioned in a previous lecture, there were multiple enlightenments, not all of them exactly the same. Um, and Locke's reception uh, was considerably different in different um, of the enlightenments. So France, for example, was French thought was heavily influenced by his essay concerning human understanding, which is a kind of a study of human consciousness and how the mind works and so forth. A kind of a modern answer to the ancient analysis of what they call the soul. Right? Whereas in America, it was the second treatise uh, in the two treatises of government, not so much at all the essay concerning human understanding. Um, in fact, the uh, second treatise had much greater impact in America than anywhere else. Um, and part of that perhaps was because it seemed to ratify so much of what Americans were already doing. Um, but Locke was really, I mean, I mentioned Hobbes could be called the father of liberalism because he establishes the basic conceptual framework uh, for liberalism. But Locke is usually considered the first great liberal thinker uh, because of his particular take on Hobbes's conceptual framework. He's kind of the quintessential liberal thinker in the sense that his take on that conceptual framework is what stuck. Um, at the same time, though, I think Locke should be considered alongside Jean-Jacques Rousseau to get a more complete picture of the foundations of liberalism as it developed over time. Uh, Rousseau brought in um, elements including an emphasis on compassion, which was not so much Hobbes and Locke both sort of stressed self-interest as a primary motivation, but Rousseau suggests that compassion is plays in a foundational role in a the right kind of politics. And then he shows Rousseau a special concern about inequality and seeing inequality as a sort of primary source of the problems of society. Um, that was not the case with uh, Hobbes or Locke, and but it is the case in modern liberalism. Um, and then finally, an inclination towards a more purely democratic government, um, a pure democracy, seeing democracy as the ideal form of government, full stop, without qualification, um, uh, that kind of thing. Uh, that there's a lot of nuances in Rousseau's case, but he plants the seeds for liberalism taking on those as key features of the liberal understanding. In relation to international politics, um, Locke was more explicit than Hobbes that international relations uh, is the relations between nations is a state of nature. Um, because there is no, in this context of different nation states, there is no international authority with sufficient enforcement power uh, to enforce international law, any kind of international agreements, and so forth. Um, and then a second point about international politics is Locke contributed in important ways to just war theory. Um, the just war theory that had been developing with modern natural law theorists like Grotius and Pufendorf and others whose names you may not have heard of, but were very important at the time. Um, it was common among those natural law theorists to talk about international law in terms of the law of nations. And the law of nations was, for them, really an application of the law of nature. Sometimes they're actually almost used interchangeably, but um, the law of nations was an application of natural law. Locke's specific uh, contributions, plural, were first his modification of Hobbes's concepts of the state of nature and state of war. Um, you can we, we can take up the question later of whether Locke is more empirically correct in his analysis of the state of nature and the state of war in international relations. But Locke's is slightly different, and the difference makes a difference. Then Locke's theory of legitimate political authority and power was very important in his contributions for thinking about international relations. And actually, that the question of legitimate power or authority is the central concern of the second treatise. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Then Locke's case for a right to revolution establishes a kind of new take on just war, just cause for war, the jus ad bellum. And then finally, his Locke's argument in the chapter on conquest on what constitutes a just conclusion of war, related to jus post bellum, establishes certain principles that became important in terms of what to do with a defeated power. I mean, what's the right way to treat a defeated power? If you've won a war, what do you do next? Looking at the context of the second treatise, part of it is a rise of absolute monarchism across Europe and starting to have an influence in England itself. It's kind of a misconception a lot of people have that before, liberal political theory, the typical form of government in the West was absolute monarchy, but that's not really the case. In the Middle Ages, in the feudal system, kings were just kind of the first among lords, and their control over the territory they oversaw was tenuous. They were relatively weak. Far from having the capacity to be absolute monarchs. That the movement towards absolute monarchism started gaining steam. I guess a typical example would be Louis the 16th. Excuse me, Louis the 14th. Louis the 16th was French Revolution. Louis the 14th was sort of the quintessential absolute monarch. But in England, it had some impact as well. You saw it, for example, with Charles I, who was deposed and beheaded during the Puritan Revolution because of his push towards absolutism. In particular, Charles's increasing use of what you could call an extra-legal administrative state, a whole system of rulemaking and courts outside of the regular legal process, the most famous part of which being the Star Chamber, through which he imposed unpopular political and ecclesiastical policies on a significantly unwilling populace. The ecclesiastical polities especially were important, of course, to the Puritans. Um, so Charles loses his head. Charles II, after the Restoration, after the um, Puritan Republic um, is kicked out, Charles II rules, and it's during Charles II's reign that Locke begins writing, um, and it's with James II, who gets deposed but keeps his head, that um, Locke's political theory really comes to the fore. Um, so there's this push towards absolute monarchism. There was also pushback, um, not only by the Puritans, but by common lawyers and parliamentarians, and by the opposition party known as the Whigs. And among the leaders of the Whigs was a man named Anthony Ashley Cooper, or Lord Shaftesbury. And Locke made an association with Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury met him. He was very impressed with Locke, and he went so far as to invite Locke to live on his estate as his kind of amateur physician and general discussant of ideas. By the way, Locke may have been an amateur physician, but he was a very talented one, and Locke actually saved Shaftesbury's life. Uh, Shaftesbury had a tumor on his liver, and Locke invented some tube that he inserted to drain off the excess fluid, and it turned out to save Shaftesbury's life. Also in association with Shaftesbury, Locke, many Americans don't know this, many South Carolinians don't know this, but Locke wrote the Constitution for the colony of South Carolina, for which Shaftesbury was one of the Lords Proprietors. In that Constitution, it's kind of complicated and maybe not what you would necessarily expect Locke to write for a Constitution. But one of the liberal features of the Constitution that was included was a pretty complete religious liberty. The only people who were exempted were atheists. So Locke didn't think they could be good citizens, I guess. But everyone else was supposed to have religious freedom in the colony. So Shaftesbury, as leader of the opposition party, the Whigs, gets himself in hot water a number of times with Charles II, and he is twice exiled from the kingdom. And Locke, because of his association with Shaftesbury, also is exiled both of those times. And it's in the second exile that Locke writes the two treatises of government. So when you think about Locke's personal history, it's not quite as traumatic, I suppose, as Hobbes. Hobbes lived through the English Civil War, of course. One of the people Hobbes most admired, Sir Godolphin, to whom he dedicates the Leviathan, was killed in that Civil War. For Locke, it was a less bloody atmosphere, but it wasn't any bed of roses either. And then when Locke published the two treatises, it was sort of perfect timing, because he published in 1688, and that was the same year of the Glorious Revolution, when James II was deposed and replaced with William and Mary. So here was a revolution. Locke was writing about a right to revolution that turned out very well. So it was nicely timed, and Locke could sort of present himself as a defender of the Glorious Revolution. Now there are a couple of challenges for interpreting for interpreting Locke's writings. Um, and the first one is his relation to Hobbes. Locke claimed that he had never read Hobbes. And this is, frankly, not credible. There's too many parallels. It's too closely following Hobbes's conceptual schema to be mere accident. Even though there were similar ideas floating around, being articulated by other thinkers, the particular formulation of those by Hobbes is the formulation that you see in Locke, and it raises the question of why was Locke not willing to mention the importance of Hobbes to his theory. Did he not want to be associated with someone who favored absolute government? That wouldn't have actually seemed to been problematic for him during the monarchy in some ways. But it does raise the question of what is Locke up to? He's somewhat of a tricky writer. There are a number of things like this where you wonder what's going on. There are things he's not telling you. There are things that seem to be maybe in conflict with each other in the things that he says that that maybe should cause the reader to be a little cautious in interpreting Locke. One of these contradictions, apparent contradictions anyway, is the relation between Locke's philosophy as presented in the essay concerning human understanding and his political theory. I mean, Locke's political theory presents a kind of quasi-traditional natural law theory, and the essay concerning human understanding is empiricist, radically empiricist, you might say. And how to reconcile a kind of an approach that assumes sort of recognition of abstract principles as essential, and a radically empiricist approach that you get in the essay concerning human understanding. It's not really easy to do, and people wonder how could someone of Locke's caliber, thinker of his caliber, have such apparently incompatible positions. And so they wonder, brings up again, is he up to something? Is he fully aware of the apparent contradiction? And is the contradiction only apparent? If it's not only apparent, why does he present it this way? Because surely he can't help but notice the discrepancy in his own writings. So the question has been debated: who is the true Locke? Was he a neo-Aristotelian Christian Whig, which seems to be how the American founders understood him, or was he, as has been put, Hobbes in sheep's clothing? He accepts Hobbes's despiritualization of politics. There's no mention anywhere in Locke of something like the soul. It doesn't seem to be relevant in any way to politics. And Locke presents human relationships and political justice like Hobbes in terms of contracts, relationships. All relationships actually in Locke get treated in terms of a kind of contractual relationship, and this is also, and this fits with the despiritualization. Um, so, yeah, Neo-Aristotelian Christian wig or Hobbes in sheep's clothing. And what are the implications of one or the other um, facts? Um, so the two treatises of government. The first treatise is not particularly important for our purposes, and the whole first treatise is really sort of ground clearing, getting out of the way a sort of wrong view, um, and it's a devastating takedown of uh, uh, one version of the divine right of kings doctrine. Uh, the, he was responding to a book by Sir Robert Filmer called Patriarcha, which understood kingship as sort of a passing down of Adam, as in Adam and Eve, passing down of his dominion over the earth. Um, and, um, and Locke analyzes this both in his own terms, in terms of reason, whether this makes rational sense, and in terms of revelation. He looks at scripture in sort of systematic way on points related to to kingship, and it's entirely convincing. But one strange thing about it is that this target, Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, is really not an impressive work. I read it myself. It's philosophically weak, um, and it almost seems as if Locke is beating the crap out of a straw man. I mean, the, he should be taking on Hobbes. I mean, he should be that. That's a serious philosopher. That's somebody who really has you know an impressive argument to make. Filmer really doesn't. So why does he do that? Again, somewhat cause for pause, perhaps. Um, the second treatise, um, before we get into that, let me just do a quick reminder of Hobbes's conceptual framework. So, for Hobbes, um, you have free and equal individuals in a state of nature, but that state of nature is a state of war. Excuse me. Um, he establishes security through a kind of contract, which he calls a covenant, um, giving all sovereign power to um, someone or few people based on consent. The contract is enforced by the government. Uh, justice is understood in terms of keeping contracts, and governance is supposed to be for uh, this to be successful through law, not under law, but certainly through law. That's a sort of nutshell uh, overview of Hobbes's conceptual framework and what Locke is working with. So, um, just a quick word about how Locke sets up the book. In chapter 1, he suggests that the aim of his book is to establish the foundation of legitimate political power. And at the end of chapter 1, he defines political power, by which he really means authority, political authority. And then at the very end of the second treatise, Locke sort of makes explicit how he has answered the challenge he set up for himself in chapter 1. So worth taking a look. Okay, so Locke's state of nature. Let me pause for a minute to maybe more explicitly than I did with Hobbes suggest a definition of the state of nature that might be helpful beyond what I've already suggested. Um, and that what I have in mind is that the state of nature, it speaks both to the state in which human beings are in relation to each other in the absence of a um, a, a governing authority with power of enforcement. Um, but it also speaks to human nature. I mean, there's as what we are as human beings, as individuals, as well as how we relate to each other. Um, so human nature is part of the mix. Um, in terms of that natural human situation without a government, um, Locke considers several relations, not just between man, but also between man and God and man and nature. And those other connections with God and nature are important to his theory. Um, in terms of human nature, um, Locke agrees with Hobbes that man is self interested, um, driven by a concern for self preservation. But Locke adds that, in addition, uh, human beings have an inclination towards preservation of the species. Um, he wants to support his own kind, and he's concerned, or has an inclination to be concerned, for the well being of others as well as himself in terms of this preservation. So Locke um, actually captures here the first two levels, foundational levels of human inclinations that Thomas Aquinas spoke of in his theory of natural law. Remember, Aquinas said, okay, all human beings have a drive for self-preservation. They also have a drive to um, to flock together with people, with creatures of their own kind, other human beings, right, to care for their young. Um, a nice way of putting this is the way Locke did, preservation of the species. And maybe he had Thomas in mind here. But it's significant that Locke stops at just 2 out of 3 of Thomas's levels of inclination, because the highest one, right, for Aquinas was sort of a rational community, knowing the truth about God and living in a rational community. That there was an inclination to that, and that was the highest one, and that was actually what differentiated man from other animals. Um, so, in comparison to Hobbes and Machiavelli, you could say, uh, for Locke, people seem less nasty, right? Um, but in comparison to the ancients, there's no talk of any kind of spiritual dimension. That higher dimension of of human nature, that part represented, if you think of Plato in that golden cord image, man is the myth of the puppet player. Um, that whole top dimension gets shut off. Um, so, what are the implications of that? Does that matter politically? Um, you get a kind of externalization of um, human relationships here. So that leads to the natural human situation. Human beings, the relationship between them, and not only between human beings and each other, but also between God, is conceived externally. I mean, our relation to God in the second treatise is we're God's property, uh, not some kind of spiritual connection or something. We're God's property, and as I've mentioned, and we'll see later, Locke treats all human beings as based on contract, kind of transactional relationship between people. Um, yeah, so gone is any kind of notion like Christian love or um, or some kind of deeper intimacy between people. Um, and then in talking further about the state of nature, um, in this natural human situation, there is a law of nature, as Hobbes said, and there is a right of nature. But Locke sees these very differently, right? Locke's law of nature is a moral law. Remember, for Hobbes, there is no natural justice. Um, because even in the state of nature, there's no right to an open-ended there's no open-ended right to aggression, uh, aggressive behavior towards others. And there's an obligation not to um, harm the interests of others unless they try to harm you, right? Um, you can harm them in self-defense, but only in self-defense, right? Um, Otherwise, you're acting unjustly. So there is a natural justice um, for Locke. And the right of nature then is a moral right. It's not just Hobbes. The right of nature was, essentially boiled down to uh, the self-interest of a person to do whatever it takes to um, preserve yourself. For Locke, it's something a little more noble than that, right? The right is a moral right. People are morally obligated to respect your natural rights. Um, and then the state of nature for Locke is not nearly as nasty a place as it is for Hobbes. Hobbes, it's a war of every man against every man. There's radical insecurity, right? Um, Locke describes the state of nature as a state of mutual assistance. Um, so in the state of nature, most people can get along fine. Without a government, most people get along fine and they live cooperatively and so forth. The problem is there are always some who don't. There are always some who want more, who want to dominate others, who want your stuff. Um, and that is what makes continuing in a state of nature, living without a government, untenable, right? Um, there's enough insecurity that's established that you've got to get out of there. Um, so again, in comparison to Hobbes' state of nature, uh, there is justice and injustice. There's a natural justice against which we can measure human behavior. Um, but in comparison to the ancients, note that man is not a political animal for Locke any more than it is for Hobbes, right? And Aristotle's idea is that human beings reach their fulfillment only in the context of political community. That political community is a natural phenomenon. It organically, uh, spontaneously develops. It's not a mere artificial man, as Hobbes put it, or a mere creation of people calculating their self-interest. Um, and for Locke, the state of nature goes along with what I was just saying. Uh, Contra Hobbes is not simply a state of war. For Hobbes, state of nature is a state of war because everybody is always anticipating the harm other people will do them, so they're arming to the teeth. And if it's not a hot war, it's at least a cold war, right? But Locke insists that a state of war requires, in his words, a sedate and settled design to bring others under your absolute will, right? There has to be a sort of deliberate um, plan and purpose to do this for there to really be a state of war. And he doesn't think that that is a design of everyone in the state of nature, not for most people, right? Um, and that's his definition of slavery, being under the absolute power or will of another. That's what slavery is.